Good afternoon. Welcome to our third section in our unit on the American Civil War and Reconstruction. In this lecture, we're going to talk about Reconstruction as well as a little bit of the effects in the Civil War, but mostly within Reconstruction, we're going to stay in the first half of it and then talk about the general effects or outcomes of Reconstruction. We will cover in more detail the second half of Reconstruction in our next unit. All right, so let's proceed. So to kind of set the stage for Reconstruction, it actually started well before the war ended, really in 1864. And as the war was coming to an end, Lincoln actually faced several issues. The four that are on your screen were the most important. How was he going to reintegrate the South back into the country? How were they going to rebuild the South after the destruction it had faced during the war? And how to end slavery? And then once emancipation was achieved, how to integrate blacks into society effectively. So these are going to be the four issues that are going to kind of persist throughout Reconstruction. All right, so Lincoln, he favored a plan where he wanted to bring the South back into the nation more quickly. If you guys read the second inaugurational speech, you'll see that. But his plan was called the 10% plan, and it was simply called that because he viewed that only 10% of all voters within the southern states needed to take an oath to come back into the Union and abide the emancipation of the slaves to be brought back into the United States, or at least bring that process or begin that process for a state government to take form and then be readmitted. Now, the plan that Lincoln had really angered much of Congress because they favored harsher terms against the South. And one of these harsher actions that Congress wanted to put through was the Wade-Davis bill, and they actually pushed this through quickly in 1864 because they were fearful of Lincoln's 10% plan. They thought that the planter aristocracy within the South would regain power and possibly even re-enslave blacks if Lincoln's plan would have been allowed to continue. So their bill set out, instead of having 10%, they would have 50% of voters take the oath of allegiance. And they also put stronger safeguards in place to protect emancipation within the Wade-Davis bill. Now, the bill itself was actually pocket vetoed by Lincoln. Essentially what he did is he just refused to sign it until they adjourned, and then it never entered into admittance. And it outraged the Republicans a lot. So much so that Louisiana, which was under control of the Union for the most part in 1864, was beginning the process of being readmitted under Lincoln's 10% plan, and Congress refused to seat those delegates in 1864. All right, now the next question is ending slavery. Now, once the Emancipation Proclamation was brought about into existence in late 1862 and then started in January 1st of 1863, the war really focused on the ending of slavery, and slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. Now, it was passed in the Senate in 1864, but it took until the end of January 1865 for it to fully pass in the House, and it abolished slavery. It effectively destroyed the South's economic system of what they had before the war, and then it nullified but didn't get completely rid of the Fugitive Slave Clause or the Three-Fifths Compromise. We'll talk about those here in just a little bit, but it does end slavery. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, this was set up, it was created by an act of Congress, and it was set up basically to help freed blacks and white refugees survive. It could help them kind of think of it as a welfare system: food, clothing, medical care, education, anything they needed to survive, especially for blacks, considering they're pretty much just starting from scratch. Now, there was mixed success for the Freedmen's Bureau in that it was fairly successful in helping a lot of freed blacks to become educated, but it really was, in essence, a failure because it didn't really help freed blacks to obtain the land that they were promised, the so-called 40 acres and a mule in most cases. And matter of fact, one of the reasons why it wasn't so successful or wasn't successful, sorry, was President Johnson tried to kill it on a couple of occasions. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And the Freedmen's Bureau just expired in 1872. It wasn't renewed. Now, furthermore, in this issue, black codes. Now, the black codes were laws developed by the southern states themselves to regulate the affairs of emancipated blacks. Essentially, they were the old slave codes before the war, just changed to take out the word slave in a lot of instances. But basically, it was aimed to keep the blacks subservient to whites, and this led to a system of sharecropping where the blacks, as well as some white, low class white farmers, were paid very little, and they had to pay to rent the land to their creditors, and essentially it was just another system of slavery. And for blacks in particular, they were really restricted in many of their legal rights, such as serving on juries, voting. The punishments were a lot harsher. You can see in the bottom picture there, those were men that were forced into basically being arrested and working on like chain gangs for very little reasons at all. It could be just as simple as being what was termed lazy or laying about and not having a job, and they would actually put them in chains. All right, here you go. Here's a map on sharecropping. You guys can pause this video and take a look at it yourselves, but it shows the percentages of sharecrop farms throughout most of the southern states after the war. All right, Dow Johnson, he was a Democrat chosen by Lincoln, and after Lincoln was assassinated, a lot of the radical Republicans who were against Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction actually were very happy in a way that Andrew Johnson had become president, because they thought he would take more of their position to be harsher on the South. But even though he didn't really do exactly the same thing that Lincoln did or wanted, he maintained in most cases what Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was going to be, and this further angered the radical Republicans to really push back against him. So really what was going on is the radical Republicans, they were pushing for harsher treatments of the South. We've already talked about that a little bit with the Wade Davis bill. But they looked at it as seeing that the war was the South's fault, and that they should really pay the harsh punishments for that to be brought in, or before they could be brought back in. And they were further, the radical Republicans were further angered by the actions of Lincoln and Johnson, because they thought they were letting them up off the mat too easily. Now, they also thought, and I mentioned this before, that the South was going to return to its old ways, and they looked to three things. Okay, the black codes, they thought that that was a strong piece of evidence that they were going to return to their old ways through them. And they also saw a lot of Southern leaders who were either prominent during the Civil War or before the Civil War in positions of power, whether it was a general within the Confederate Army or a senator or a representative or what have you, were actually retaining seats in the governments in those states. So they were afraid of that. And they were also afraid that now the South was going to be stronger after time, and then they were going to lose their control or hold in Congress. A little bit of a political agenda there. So you take all of this, you take the fact that Andrew Johnson and Congress are at odds, the clashes are going to start coming. So what happens is in early 1866, Johnson actually vetoes the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. I told you he tried to kill it earlier, and this further angers Congress. So what Congress does is the next month they actually pass what's known as the Civil Rights Bill, where it grants citizenships to black citizens in the United States, the freedmen. Johnson vetoes this bill. Now this is going to begin a period of time in our government where Congress is going to continually override Johnson's vetoes through the actions that they're trying to get passed. So they're really going at odds with each other, and Johnson's going to veto something, Congress is going to override it. And this is going to push for the passage of the 14th Amendment, because Congress is going to look at it and say, hey, we really need to get things done. So here's the 14th Amendment. It was ratified in 1868. It conferred civil rights on all people, including freedmen. It abolished the 3/5 clause permanently, and really this amendment becomes a major pillar of our constitutional law. And in essence, it's probably the most important amendment in our Constitution outside of the First Amendment in a lot of ways. Now, it did not grant the right to vote. It stopped short at just that. So that was some issues that radical Republicans did not like, but they viewed it that no state could come back into the Union without ratifying this amendment, because they saw it as something that they really needed. Now, that was key, because when they stated that, Johnson, who was at odds again, remember, with Congress, started telling the southern states to reject the amendment, and they did. Actually, all but Tennessee did in 1866, and it would take some time for it to be ratified. Now, what happens is Johnson's getting sick and tired of fighting with Congress, so he shifts to a campaign of speeches across the country to help Democrats and people that are more in line with his idea of thinking or aren't against him to get into office for the 1866 congressional elections. Now, it fails miserably. He gets heckled a lot. He turns angry at people, and it works very well for the Republicans against him, and they take a really easy election, and it creates a Congress that can easily veto anything that the president does, no matter what he tries to set out and do. So the Republicans gain pretty much complete control, and they're going to focus on a complete transformation of Reconstruction. So this leads to, in 1867, a series of Reconstruction acts. Now, there were race riots that actually erupted in the South because of the actions that were being pushed, actions by white Southerners that were against what was happening, as well as even African Americans who were against what was happening to them. So there was issues going on there, and the social fabric and cultural fabric was being torn apart in the South, which led to those riots. But in March of 1867, these Congressional Reconstruction Acts were passed. Now, in these acts, the South was divided into 5 military districts, so you have a military Reconstruction period. They were each led by a specific general and policed by federal troops, almost like martial law in a lot of ways in the South. Southern states were again required to ratify the 14th Amendment. It took some time, but they did eventually. And then Southern states also had to guarantee suffrage for former male slaves. Excuse me, all former male slaves. And the goal here was to create a voting base by guaranteeing voting rights for all former male slaves, so that they could get these states effectively back into the Union. And it actually fails because of the programs that were set forth didn't do enough to protect the justices of the freedmen in the South, and it led to further problems that we'll get into in the civil rights movement later between African Americans and white Southerners. Now here you can see the Southern military districts, and when the states were brought back in and readmitted to the Union with their ratification of the 14th Amendment. Sorry, just blanking on the word there. Now, the 15th Amendment, we're almost done. Republicans were fearful that the Southern states, with the 14th Amendment and all these Reconstruction Acts, were going to agree to everything, and then once they had agreed to them, they were going to go amend their constitutions and then take away the right to vote for blacks, because it wasn't a full constitutional amendment that said, hey, look, they can vote. So they pushed for the 15th Amendment, and this amendment was ratified in 1870, and it prohibited the denial of vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which was important because it meant that anybody could vote based on race or color, or if they were a previous slave. But it failed in one aspect. It did not solve the issue of women's suffrage. It didn't even mention women, and that's going to be an issue that won't get resolved until the early 1900s. All right, now, some positives out of this: black advancements. Reconstruction did fail to fully accomplish its goals in a lot of ways, but blacks did seize the initiative um, at this time to advance themselves as best they could, particularly in two areas, education and politics, because the economic way wasn't really working with sharecropping and all that stuff. But education and politics was an area that a lot of African Americans could advance. And the Union League, which had existed before the war, became the catalyst for this advancement in society for African Americans in the South, particularly in politics, representation in legal rights, education, and then in a religious form as well. And this led to advancement to where a lot of African Americans were starting to gain, males were gaining political seats at the state and federal levels. All right, now, it's the South, and we've mentioned the racial riots earlier on in 1867. There were a lot of Southerners that were really angry about what happened in terms of Reconstruction early on. They were angry against the empowerment of their former slaves, and they're angry against their white allies that had come to help them or had moved to the South, which they viewed for their own gain, just to take things away from the southern states, which had lost so much. And matter of fact, a lot of white Southerners who were against these people called the whites that were supporting the blacks carpetbaggers, those from the north coming down, as well as scalawags who had lived in the South, and these were detrimental names to these people, and they viewed them as being people that were just taking advantage of the South again, and really they weren't. But it was, again, just the representation that was going on. Now, one of the groups, the most famous, the Ku Klux Klan, that was developed to push back against blacks as well as carpetbaggers, started to undertake this campaign of intimidation, where they would set fire to houses of both blacks and carpetbaggers, as well in some cases even kill people to intimidate them to either leave, to not vote, or any number of things to push back against the empowerment that they were granted by the United States government. And Congress became so upset by this that they actually passed in 1870 and 1871 what became known as the Force Acts to upend these types of attacks, but the damage had already been done and they really didn't do a whole lot. All right, so impeachment. Now, Congress's hate for Johnson, we've already talked about a lot in terms of it just kept growing, growing, and growing. And in 1867, they passed over a Johnson veto, what was known as the Tenure of Office Act. And this act basically just said that the president had to get approval from the Senate to remove any approved appointee he had put into position. So what happens is in 1868, Johnson dismisses Edwin M. Stanton, a member of his cabinet, without approval of the Senate. This begins the process of the impeachment. Now, the House quickly votes to impeach him. It's not even a close vote. He's impeached in the House. But then it goes to the Senate, and Johnson survives impeachment by one vote. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but two of the main reasons for why he survived is many didn't want to destabilize the country any more than it had been in the previous months and years. And then also the vice presidency was not filled during Johnson's presidency, and they didn't like the candidate who would become president afterwards. So therefore, there were 7 people in the Senate that actually just voted not guilty, and that swayed the vote in his favor. And then Johnson, after hearing this vote, agreed to stop obstructing Republican policies. He agreed to stop doing the vetoes so he could stay in office. And he wouldn't stay in office very long. Matter of fact, in the presidential election of 1868, General Grant, or now President Grant, would take over and win the seat. All right, so our last slide here, the legacy of Reconstruction. White Southerners were very embittered by it, more so by Reconstruction than the war itself. in a lot of ways. They resented how their economic, political, and social systems had been destroyed or changed radically. They hated a lot of the empowerment issues that were, or actions that were given to blacks, as well as federal intervention into what they viewed as local affairs or state affairs. And that was kind of a negative there for a lot of white Southerners. However, the Reconstruction did help the war, helped end the war, and helped bring the country back peacefully in some ways together, which is unheard of in a lot of ways in terms of if you look at civil wars in the history of the world. Now, Republicans did push to protect blacks throughout Reconstruction, but it was also at the extent of trying to promote their agenda, which in some ways helped freedmen, but also hurt them as well. And then ultimately, the policies, in many ways, instead of actually reconstructing the South and actually changing it, really resurrected the Old South, which meant that there was going to be a continuation of the harsh times for Southern blacks. Although they wouldn't be slaves, it would be a recontinuation of what really was going on prior to that. All right, guys, have a good one.